Pat Iyer here, host of Legal Nurse Podcast. In this upcoming series of podcasts, I'll be sharing with you some specific shows about working on forensic cases. Legal nurse consultants can serve criminal defense attorneys and criminal prosecutors in a variety of ways, and our programming is designed to bring some of those concepts to you. Be sure to check out the conference that is coming up May 30, 31, and June 1st, 2024, called Murder Mysteries Unraveled. This is a 3-day conference highlighting a variety of topics to give you the skills that you need to effectively consult on criminal cases. You'll meet a variety of experts and participate in activities that will open up your eyes to the opportunities that exist to get your foot in the door in this field or to get more cases from attorneys who are handling criminal cases. Look for that link at the end of the video and also right below here, which is lnc.tips/murder. Now for the show. Welcome to Legal Nurse Podcast. I'm Pat Iyer, and today we're going to focus on a topic that should be of great interest to you if you are working in the arena of criminal cases. I have with me a person who is an individual who is certified as a sexual assault nurse examiner. She's board certified as an advanced forensic nurse, and she runs the business called Intrepid Forensic Healthcare Consulting. She testifies both nationally and internationally. Welcome to the show, Teresa Devitt-Lynch.
Hi, Pat. How are you?
I'm doing well. We wanted to talk today about the topic that many legal nurse consultants are asked about. These files can come into the office of the prosecutor or the criminal defense attorney, and that is that somebody has died. The question is, was it homicide? Was it suicide? So let's talk about why that is a challenge to answer that question.
Sometimes it starts at the scene. You might have a very keen murderer who is able to successfully, or hopefully not successfully, stage a murder scene to look like a suicide. And so that's why, a very well-rounded investigation is required. There are some homicide and suicide scenes that are readily identifiable as such, but there are those cases where more investigation is required to make the correct determination. And ultimately, you don't want the system to allow a criminal to get free, and this would be one of the more heinous situations in which the wrong determination of death could lead to that. So you've got the death investigator who in some jurisdictions shows up to the crime scenes if they have that support. Otherwise, photographs of the crime scene and other evidence collected along with the pathologist reports and their findings can assist in distinguishing suicide from homicide. But there's also those times where just looking at the body and just looking at the pathology of the body, the medical examiner is not able to fully make a well-informed, evidence-based decision on the manner of death. And so they may need more information to assist them in that. Excuse me.
And then as we consider as legal nurse consultants helping to gather that additional information, what are some of the pieces of evidence that go into making the determination? I know you've mentioned the condition of the scene, but are there other factors that we should be considering?
Yes. Not only the condition of the scene, but the trace evidence that was or was not found at the scene is very important. Positioning of the body. Is the position of the body in line with a possible suicide, or is it more consistent with a homicide situation? Any eyewitness accounts, and then, of course, the autopsy and subsequent testing from the autopsy that may be done, such as forensic toxicology, and testing of trace elements that were on the body itself.
Those are a lot of factors. And I know you may not know anything about that individual when you're assisting with a death investigation. What are some of the factors, like the mental or physical health of that individual, that could contribute to answering the question of, was it a murder or was it a suicide?
Sometimes it is prudent for the forensic examiner or forensic pathologist to get additional information. One of the key goals in forensic science is to hopefully eliminate, but certainly limit, the amount of conscious or unconscious bias that could play into the determination of a crime scene by a CSI, or the manner of death by the forensic pathologist, or even for me dealing with live patients. If I do a suspect examination, I don't always get a lot of information to help mitigate any bias I might have. But in some situations, such as trying to determine homicide from suicide, having more information does help to make the correct determination. So did the victim or the dead person have any ongoing chronic health conditions? Were they terminally ill with something? Did they have any mental health conditions? Were they, bipolar? Did they have depression? Were they schizophrenic? Was there a history of drug or alcohol addiction? And then what were the social relationships and activities? Were they socially active? Did they have healthy relationships? Were they one to isolate themselves and spend a lot of time alone and antisocial? And then, two of the key elements is, do they have previous suicide ideations or attempts? And was there a presence of a suicide note at the scene? So for a forensic pathologist to, in some circumstances, having this information significantly helps them to determine between a homicide and a suicide.
Of course, in the novels that I read, Teresa, the murderer forces the victim to write a suicide note.
Of course they do. Or nowadays they can just text it to everybody that they know. So it's changing all the time.
I know. I recall a young girl who I took care of in a hospital, who had trauma injuries from being pushed off a roof. And what was interesting was that the healthcare providers documented that she was trying to commit suicide. So all throughout her medical record, it said she was trying to commit suicide, and yet it turned out that she had been pushed. Now, she was fortunate that she survived, although she had a lot of orthopedic injuries. Tell us about what to think about in that type of scenario when a person's found on the ground at the base of a building. What kinds of factors go into determining whether they were pushed or they jumped?
So as an LNC, we're nurses, jack of all trades, master of, well, we're all masters of something. But that saying, jack of all trades, master of none. So, for an LNC who's going to do criminal cases, I highly recommend that they become familiar with basic forensic evidence collection processes, other forensic specialties, DNA, forensic toxicology, biomechanics that may apply. And when you're talking about jumping or being pushed from a great height, did they jump? Did they fall? Was it an accident, or did somebody actually push them? One thing to look into and to possibly recommend to the attorney with whom you're working is the use of the forensic application of analytic mechanics. It's really you know mechanical engineers who can help to analyze what was the trajectory off of the building or off of the mountain. How far out, how much force did it take for them to land 10 feet from the building? How much force would it have taken for them to land 2 feet from the building? Could this have been based on their height, their weight, the height of the fall? Could this have been an accident where they merely fell down? And what would have been their rate of travel moving down? And all of that information, a forensic pathologist can look at a lot, and detectives and crime scene investigators, they can look at a lot of information and give a lot of answers. But sometimes in these particular situations, being able to pinpoint some of the forces required and how fast they would have been traveling down and such, and how is it that they landed in this particular situation, by getting a mechanical engineer to apply some mechanical processes to this, can be very helpful. That's just one thing. There's other things when you're talking about somebody jumping or being pushed from a height. The crime scene, and obviously as a legal nurse consultant, we come in after the fact, after the charges have been filed, after the crime scene has been collected and gathered, but we want to make sure to look at all of the available evidence, and that would include any crime scene photographs. So in those, you're looking for any signs of a struggle that may account for any injuries that are not present. Are there any signs of a struggle that may have happened prior to the fall? When you're looking at the victim's medical records and the victim's autopsies, did they have any injuries that were defensive wounds that they could have been fighting somebody off? Or did they have injuries from being attacked or assaulted prior to falling or being pushed or jumping over the ledge or whatever? Also, did the forensic pathologist identify any signs of death? Were there any brain injuries that or any other injuries that would have caused death prior to falling? Obviously, that would lean heavily towards the homicide aspect of it. And just looking at all of those to see what information is available and is there that can help you, but then also looking for information that may be missing. In certain circumstances, they might be able to go back and gather more information. If it's evidence that wasn't collected at a crime scene, obviously they can't go back and do that. But I'm always looking for, what information do I have related to this? What can I get? What can I recommend? And what is just missing and I won't be able to get?
Mm-hmm. And I know in our conference coming up, we're going to have an investigator talk about collection of evidence at the scene. And it is the one shot that you have to collect that data or collect those objects before the scene gets trampled over, destroyed, opened up again for use. It's critical to think about what you need at the time, because you only have one opportunity.
Exactly. And even if, some patients that may still be living when the police or EMS get there, and they go to an ER, and then maybe subsequently to an OR or any other emergency healthcare setting, considering what evidence could have been, should have been, was collected in those settings is important too.
If we think about another mechanism of murder, which is gunshot wounds, I know that there are some factors that we should consider as healthcare providers, as legal nurse consultants, looking at documentation created by police or by investigators or by medical professionals who are looking at the body after it's brought to an emergency department, for example. What are some of those factors that we should be considering?
Gunshot wounds is one of the more common methods of suicide, especially in men versus women. But when looking at that information, the injury location is one of the key things. Obviously, suicide, it needs to, the injury has to be in a manner and a location that is accessible to the victim. So most commonly, you get suicides that include gunshot wounds to the side of the head, in the mouth, or maybe the front of the chest. If there's gunshot wounds to the abdomens, the side, or the back, those are more so they're more likely to be associated with a homicide versus a suicide. Also, the number of shots. If there's multiple numbers of shots, unless that was a very, very strong-willed person, chances are it's going to be a homicide. Now, you can't rule it out completely, because I'm sure that there may have been suicides where somebody did shoot themselves multiple times, but chances are it's going to be more consistent with a homicide rather than a suicide. And then the entrance wound, like I mentioned, it needs to be somewhere where the victim could logically reach it, where their handling of the gun would be logical for them. For instance, if they're a right-handed person, but they have a gunshot wound to the left temple, then and they don't generally shoot with their left hand, then I would consider that suspicious. If they have a gunshot to the back, unless they set up a mechanism to shoot themselves in the back, such as tying. I was reading in a journal in preparation for this, and there's one case study where the gentleman actually did commit suicide by shooting himself in the back. He tethered, or he tied the gun and set up a pulley system to a tree and did it that way. Now, had the pathologist not had that information and had somebody taken away the rope and the rope from the scene, it very well could have looked like a homicide, but they did determine that was a suicide. But in general, people are not going to commit suicide by trying to shoot themselves in the back. It has to be in a place that is going to be logical for their hand to reach. So if they have short arms and it's all the way across their body, is it logical for that person to have been able to hold the gun? And would it have been prudent for them, to do it there? So those are things to consider when you're talking about looking at gunshot wounds versus, suicide versus homicide. And then also, if you just consider, holding the gun to yourself, just about anywhere. And I did this yesterday when I was thinking about this and reading on these, but just in mimicking holding a gun to myself, if you kind of look at it, there's usually a little bit of an upward trajectory versus a straight across if you have somebody holding the gun against your temple. So just looking at some of those intimate details, those very fine details of the scene and of the victim.
And I know that you can tell from looking at entrance wounds in some cases whether that bullet entered the body from a great distance or from close up. How does that factor into this consideration of homicide versus suicide?
Well, that's very significant. It goes back to, is the distance based upon the entrance wound, exit wounds, is the distance that can be estimated by that logical with their arm length? So if you have a gunshot entrance exit wound, there are no traces of gunshot residue on there. There's no bruising or burning from the nuzzle mark on that area, then chances are it was a distant shot. And so is it logical that somebody would hold the gun that far from them and shoot that? More likely you're going to see those gunshot entrance and exit wounds, mainly the entrance wounds, if they hold it up to their temple, you'll see a burn mark there. If they're just a few inches away, you'll see some gunshot residue and maybe some stippling, depending on how close it is. So yes, that is one of the key things, because if it is not a close, very up to the skin, or very close range, then the likelihood is that it's probably not a suicide. So understanding how to interpret gunshot wounds, the entrances and the exits are important in this. If you are looking to determine, if you're looking to determine any part of the gunshot wound, what is the exit, what is the entrance, and how close, approximately how close was the gun from that person, and what angle was it going to as well.
What about the type of death that involves an injury from a knife or a sharp object? What should we be thinking about as legal nurse consultants in helping to differentiate that type of a death versus a suicidal death?
So knife and sharp force deaths as suicides are less common than are, the shootings, but they are one of the more common methods. The most common is on the wrists, and generally cutting upward on the wrist to get as much of that vein opened and artery opened as possible to exsanguinate a little bit faster. But there are some people who might stab themselves in the heart to hope, in hopes of getting a quick death with a sharp stab. But in those, you would look for, are there prior cut marks? Do they have a history of cutting, especially if the fatal injuries are on the wrist? Do they have other cut marks on the wrists or the legs? Those are common areas for people who are cutting that may consider slashing their wrists as a form of suicide. But if you're talking about a stab wound specifically into the heart area, then you would want to look for the number of wounds and the locations. So if it was a murder, more, the stab wounds, you might have more stab wounds. The majority of you might have different lengths of the stab wounds, but you wouldn't have you may not have a lot of hesitation marks in the stab wounds, meaning very superficial stab wounds instead of the long, deep ones. In suicide, you might see, when you're looking at stabbing oneself, you might see some hesitation stab wounds. So those would be the very shallow, maybe testing the knife to see how much force they need to put it in, to see how they're going to tolerate it, to just kind of practice. Maybe you might see some shallower ones. And then that one fatal. It is more common to find multiple deep stabs or completed to the hilt of the knife on murder victims than it is in suicide victims.
All grim topics, Teresa, all grim.
It is, but I talk about it with a smile.
Well, let's move on to something in terms of drowning. And this is one of my personal fears is getting trapped in a vehicle that's going underwater. We had in the United States, a recent case of a woman who was a billionaire who was driving home at night onto her Texas property, and she made a K-turn, maneuvering it to back up, and her Tesla, the allegation is that her Tesla didn't function appropriately, or she didn't use it appropriately. She ended up in the car going backwards into a pond in her property. And the allegations initially were that they thought there was a criminal act, but she called a friend and said, I'm trapped in my car, and told her or him what happened and asked for help, and they couldn't get there in time. She was found
Oh,
in her car. So that was not a suicide. It was not a homicide. It was an accidental death.
oh.
Tell us a little bit more about that process of looking at somebody who is retrieved from a vehicle. Maybe in this case, she was retrieved within an hour, but sometimes people are found dead in a car 30 years later.
Mm-hmm. Most drowning deaths are related to accidents and often involve drugs and alcohol, but certainly there could be a suicide via drowning. There can also be, I mean, obviously, I watch a lot of Dateline. I've seen more than one drowning homicide on Dateline. So, but in this situation, distinguishing or proving a drowning is very difficult because it's essentially a diagnosis by exclusion. It's when you have those injuries, such as asphyxiation, being smothered, or being strangled, or being drowned, things that remove the ability for the brain and the body to get oxygen. There's no blow to the body to identify. There's no specific injury to identify. And so they usually rely, this is when a lot of the times they do rely on circumstances of the incident to help them to identify if it was a drowning, because this is usually, it's a diagnosis of exclusion when there's really no other explanation. And so they look at what happened, where was it, was there water in the lungs that would show that the person was alive when they got into the water. If there's no water in the lungs, then they may have been dead before they got into the water. But this is one of the more difficult things for a forensic pathologist to identify and distinguish. And again, with the others determining homicide, suicide, accident, you want to look for, are there any defensive wounds? Are there any signs of a struggle or an attack or an assault of some sort prior to getting into the water? Is there a presence of drugs or alcohol in the victim's system? And was there, obviously go back to that suicide note. Is there a suicide note present there too? So this is not one of the more common methods of suicide, but it is certainly a challenge for forensic pathologists to distinguish.
And then finally, the last type of a death that we would raise in terms of was it homicide, was it suicide, is when somebody is found hanging. What should we be thinking about as legal nurse consultants with that type of a death?
So, you mentioned earlier talking about the books that you read and the murder mysteries that you read, and one way to stage a scene that always comes to mind for me is for someone to be strangled with a ligature, a rope, a TV cord, or something, a belt, something like that. And then to stage the scene to look like a suicide, they hang the person over their balcony on the house, or they hang them from the ceiling in their living room, or over the banister from their first and second floors. But in these situations, a true hanging death, I mean, the person was either, through suicide or other means, they were hung to death. You will get a V shape from the rope, because what happens is the body weight pulls till the rope is taut, but then our head is still pretty weighted, and the head kind of goes down and you get a V shape that way. However, if you are strangled with another option with another object or a mechanism by another person, say you're strangled from behind, you would still have potentially that ligature mark on the skin. But in most cases, and this would depend on the height of the person doing the strangling, in most cases, you're either going to have a horizontal ligature mark or marks, depending on how much of a struggle there was, versus that V ligature mark. And so that's one telltale way to distinguish, was this crime scene maybe staged? Did they actually hang, or did somebody strangle them and then stage it to look like a hanging? Because in order for the ligature marks, whether it's from the hanging or a ligature of whatever means, for those bruises to show up, the blood needs to have, or the body, excuse me, needs to have blood flowing in order to cause those bruises. So if somebody strangles somebody with a ligature to death, you'll have those ligature marks probably. But then when they hang them and they're no longer living, you won't have the V shape. So that's pretty easy to distinguish.
And of course, also, if there are defensive wounds from some type of a struggle prior to that, that would be another sign.
Yes, yes. And you might find different scratches or bruising to the neck where the victim was trying to get that ligature off of their neck. You might find broken nails. You might find the assailant's DNA underneath the fingernails from them maybe scratching them. So yes, looking at all that evidence is key in these cases.
Well, Teresa, we have covered so many mechanisms, and I know that there'll be questions in people's minds after they hear this podcast, or they may want assistance with a legal nurse consultant's behind the scenes consulting on a criminal case. What would be the best way for them to reach you?
My website is www.intrepidfhc.com. And my email is tdevitt-lynch, that's TDEVITTLYNCH @intrepidfhc.com.
And if you would spell intrepid for us, just as a precaution.
So it would be my first initial last name, tdevitt-lynch @intrepidfhc.com. That's INTREPIDFHC for Intrepid Forensic Healthcare Consulting.
Perfect. Intrepidfhc.com.
Yes, all together.
Thank you so much. I appreciate everything that you have shared and look forward to the next time that you are with us on a podcast, Teresa.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
Coming up next, you're going to have an opportunity to go into a chilling world. This is the key word for this next presentation. When you have an opportunity to meet a forensic nurse who has her doctorate degree in nursing practice, who has a special interest in a topic that makes you want to run out of the room, and yet you don't want to miss a word. And that is healthcare serial killers. Meet Pamela Tabor, who will tell you in just a couple of minutes what we finished discussing in her podcast, which we just finished recording.
Thank you. The podcast was very exciting. There's so much information I would love to give you. I could talk on it for hours. That we covered what is a healthcare serial killer? How do you define them? And how are they different from healthcare serial killers in general? We also talked about what piqued my interest to get into this area of nursing, which is quite chilling and frightening. We spent some time talking about methods, the most commonly used methods that healthcare serial killers use in their work environment to kill patients. We also looked at ways that, or things that we can observe in coworkers that should pique our interest or make us a little bit suspicious. How do we know who they should be looking at if a case is open? So things that you can think about and reflect on your coworkers. We also want to look at red flags. What are red flags that trigger this? then I think for me, most importantly, we were looking at how the LNC can incorporate this into their practice. Why you are in such a phenomenal position to really help lead the way into this due to having such extensive knowledge medically and legally. I would love to see LNCs get more involved in this. And so we talked about a few ways, few tips to get started or things that you can do to be involved.
Thank you, Pamela. Be sure to check out our next episode of Legal Nurse Podcast and meet Dr. Pamela Tabor when we talk about healthcare serial killers. I'll see you there. I hope you got some great tips from this program. Be sure to check out our 3-day conference coming up May 30, 31, and June 1st on murder. If you see this podcast after those dates, you can go to the link below the video, lnc.tips/murder, and get the recordings for the conference. Use those to build your knowledge about forensic cases. And I'll see you on the next show.